The lost signal. The altimeter is spinning. The radio is dead. And somewhere in the vast frozen expanse of the Alaskan Brooks Range, a bush pilot is running out of time. His name is Davie Fulton, and this is his story. To understand what happened to Davie Fulton on the 14th of November, you have to understand the life that put him in that cockpit. Fairbanks, Alaska, one of the coldest inhabited places on the surface of the earth. A city where the winter cold is not an inconvenience but a presence. Something with weight and intention. Something that gets into your vehicle overnight and makes it a question every single morning whether the engine is going to turn over. Davie had lived there his entire adult life. He had stopped noticing the cold the way people stop noticing the noise of a city they grew up in. It was simply the terms and conditions of the life he had chosen. And he had chosen it, deliberately, eyes open. He had gotten his license at 19, scraped together the hours doing anything anyone would pay him for. Tow plane work, banner flying, ferrying parts to remote sites for oil contractors who needed things yesterday. By the time he was 26, he had enough hours and enough saved to put a deposit on a Cessna 185. The 185 is not a flashy aircraft. It is a workhorse, a six-cylinder, single-engine taildragger that has been hauling people and cargo into remote Alaskan strips since the 1960s. It will not win awards for passenger comfort, but it will get in and out of places that would make other aircraft weep. Short gravel bars, frozen lakes, bush strips cut out of the tree line by men with chainsaws and a very high tolerance for risk. In Alaska, that is worth more than speed. That plane was Davie's business, his pension, his mortgage. Every hour he flew, it was an hour he was providing for his family, and he treated it with the particular reverence that working men reserve for the tools that keep the lights on. He had met Annette at a barbecue in the summer of 2009. Practical, grounded. The kind of woman who did not catastrophize, but who also did not pretend that her husband's job was without risk. She had done the research early in their relationship, read the accident statistics, understood the weather patterns, understood the particular hazards of flying single-engine over terrain where a forced landing meant wilderness, not a highway. She had decided she could live with it. That did not mean she stopped listening for the sound of his truck in the driveway when the weather turned. George was 12, Gary was 9. Both of them had their father's build and their mother's sense, which Davie considered an excellent combination. George was already talking about flying. Gary was going to be trouble in the best possible sense. Davie was proud of both of them in the quiet way he was proud of most things. The bush flying community in Alaska is small enough that everyone knows everyone, and large enough that there is always someone new to hear a story about. It is a brotherhood built on shared risk and mutual respect. Practical, understated. The kind of people who will help you strip an engine in a snowstorm without being asked and will never mention it again. They talk about the ones they have lost the way soldiers talk about theirs. Not often, not dramatically, but with a weight that tells you the losses are present even when they are not being discussed. Alaska has claimed more bush pilots than anyone likes to count, and every pilot in that community knows the list. Davie Fulton was not reckless. He was experienced, disciplined, and deeply respectful of the country he flew over. But he was also a working man with a family to feed. And on the morning of November the 14th, the work called, and he answered it. The morning started the way most of Davie's mornings started, before the light. He was up at 5, the kitchen dark except for the light above the stove that Annette always left on when he had an early departure. Coffee on, boots by the door. The pre-flight paperwork spread across the kitchen table, while the house was still quiet and the boys were still asleep. He checked the weather first. He always checked the weather first. The briefing out of Fairbanks Flight Service showed a system building to the west, a significant low, tracking northeast, with the leading edge expected to reach the Brooks Range by late afternoon. The window looked workable. The drop was 60 miles northeast of Coldfoot. Flight time up, roughly 45 minutes. The drop itself, call it 30 minutes on the ground. Flight time back, another 45. Wheels down in Fairbanks well before the weather arrived. He had done tighter margins than this. The 3 hunters were waiting at the airstrip when he arrived. They were from Texas, from the accents. Big men with good gear and the particular energy of people who have been looking forward to something for a long time. They had drawn a Dahl sheep tag in the Brooks Range, one of the most coveted tags in North American hunting, the kind that takes years on a waiting list and costs serious money when it finally comes through. They loaded without drama, distributed the weight the way Davie directed, and buckled in without being asked twice. The eldest of the three, a man named Curtis with a gray beard and quiet eyes, leaned forward as Davie was running through the final checks. "Weather going to hold?" he asked. "Long enough," Davie said, and he believed it when he said it. The flight north was the part of the job that never got old, even after all the years, even after all the hours. The Brooks Range in November from 800 feet was one of the most extraordinary things a human being could put in front of their eyes. The mountains rolled beneath them in every shade of white and gray, and the deep bruised blue of shadow. The rivers were frozen hard, their courses visible as pale ribbons threading between the ridges. The spruce forest thinned as they pushed north, giving way to open tundra that stretched to the horizon like a vast, indifferent sea. The cabin was solid and well-maintained, owned by an outfitter who had been running sheep hunts in this country for 30 years. The strip was short, gravel, frozen hard, with a slight uphill grade that helped with the stopping. Davie had landed here more times than he could remember. He put the 185 down with the unhurried precision of a man who has made his peace with a particular piece of ground. The hunters unloaded efficiently, gear stacked, handshakes all round. Curtis looked up at the western sky for a moment before he shouldered his pack. "You take care up there," he said. "Always do," Davie said. He watched them disappear into the tree line. Then he turned the 185 around and climbed back into the gray afternoon sky. It was 12:47. The system to the west had accelerated. That happened. The models were good, but they were not perfect, and Alaskan weather had a long history of outrunning its own forecasts. The leading edge that was supposed to arrive after 1,400 hours was already pushing hard across the range by the time Davie leveled off and pointed south. He saw it before he felt it. A wall of gray to the southwest, moving with the kind of purpose that experienced pilots learn to respect immediately and absolutely. He pushed the throttle forward, bought himself whatever extra knots the 185 had to give. It was not enough. The storm took the visibility first. 1 minute he had 5 miles, then 2. Then the white closed in from every direction simultaneously, and he was flying on instruments in conditions that were deteriorating faster than he could adapt to them. He tightened his scan, altimeter, attitude indicator, heading, airspeed. The disciplined, rhythmic cross-check that keeps a pilot alive when the world outside the windscreen stops making sense. The turbulence hit next. Not the uncomfortable chop of ordinary mountain wave. Something heavier, more sustained. The kind of turbulence that makes the aircraft feel suddenly very small and very fragile. He keyed the radio. "Fairbanks Radio, this is Cessna November 47 Foxtrot Tango. Severe weather. Position approximately 40 miles north of Coldfoot. Altitude 800 feet. Heading 180. And then the static came in like a door slamming. He tried again. Twice. 3 times. Nothing. What happened in the next 6 minutes is the kind of thing that is easier to describe than it is to survive. The downdraft caught him over a ridge he could not see coming. Pushed the nose down hard. By the time he had the attitude back, the altimeter was showing 400 feet, and the terrain below him was invisible and rising. He made the decision that good pilots make and bad pilots are too proud to make. He was not going to outfly this. He needed to get the aircraft on the ground, whatever ground he could find. Right now. The frozen gravel bar appeared out of the white with almost no warning, a pale strip between dark walls of spruce, narrow, shorter than he would have liked, but real and flat and present. He put the 185 down. The left wing caught the spruce at the edge of the bar. A glancing blow that was still enough to spin the aircraft hard to the left, grinding across the frozen gravel in a shrieking of metal before it stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that follows violence. Davie sat in the tilted cockpit and breathed. Left shoulder. Bad. Ribs. Worse. The windscreen was cracked. The left wing was destroyed. The engine had stopped. Outside, the storm hammered the fuselage with complete indifference. He reached behind the seat for the emergency kit, found the survival blanket, activated the emergency locator transmitter, pulled the blanket tight around his shoulders. Annette would be starting to think about dinner about now. George would be home from school. Gary would be asking what was for tea. He settled back into the seat, and he waited. Sandra Reeves had been the duty coordinator at the Alaska Rescue Coordination Center in Anchorage for 19 years. In that time, she had managed over 200 search and rescue operations across the state. She had found people who should not have survived and lost people who should have. She did not take any of it lightly, not the first case and not the 207th. She was at her desk when the alert came in at 13:22. A faint, intermittent pulse from an emergency locator transmitter registered by the COSPAS SARSAT satellite network. Fragmentary, dropping in and out, the kind of trace that told you the transmitter was damaged or partially buried or both. She pulled up the position data and felt a particular tightening in her chest that she had learned over 19 years to pay attention to. The coordinates were shifting with every satellite pass. A quarter-mile variance, then half a mile, then back again. The storm hammering the Brooks Range was doing what storms do to radio signals in mountainous terrain, bouncing them off valley walls, scattering them across ridge lines, turning what should have been a clean fix into something that looked more like a probability cloud than a location. In clear conditions, they would have had him pinned within minutes. In this, she was looking at a search box of approximately 40 square miles. 40 square miles of ravines and frozen riverbeds and spruce forest, all of it buried under a ground blizzard that was making fixed-wing operations impossible and helicopter ops marginal at best. She cross-referenced the signal with the flight plans filed out of Fairbanks that morning. One aircraft unaccounted for, Cessna 185, November 47, Foxtrot Tango. Pilot Davie Fulton. Departed Fairbanks at 0640. Expected return no later than 14:30. It was now 13:22. He was not late yet, but the signal was active, and the weather between his last known position and home was not survivable for long in a downed aircraft. She did not wait for him to be officially overdue. She picked up the phone and started making calls. The aircraft that went in was an HH-60G Pave Hawk out of Alaskan Air Force Base, crewed by the 210th Rescue Squadron. These are not people who need a long briefing. They are trained specifically for personnel recovery in hostile and austere environments. They have operated in conditions that would ground every other aviation asset in the state and have done it routinely, professionally, and with a casualty rate among their own people that reflects the absolute seriousness with which they approach the work. They were wheels up within 40 minutes. On board was a para-rescueman named Specialist Aaron Briggs, 29 years old, 4 years with the 210th. He had been on the hoist more times than he had kept count of, in conditions ranging from uncomfortable to genuinely life-threatening. He was not a man who wasted energy on worry. He spent the flight north checking his kit, medical bag, hypothermia wrap, litter, the personal gear that went with him every time the door opened and the wind came in. They also carried a long-range thermal imaging drone, a purpose-built unit ruggedized for extreme cold operations, capable of maintaining stable flight in winds that would ground a conventional system. Its sensor package combined high-resolution optical imaging with forward-looking infrared that could detect temperature differentials invisible to the human eye. In clear conditions, it could identify a human heat signature from 1,500 feet. In these conditions, it was the most powerful search tool they had in the air. The drone operator, a young airman named Kowalski, ran through his pre-deployment checks as the Pave Hawk pushed north into the deteriorating weather. He had done this before. He would find the signal or he would not, but he would give it everything the system had. Back in Fairbanks, Annette Fulton's phone rang at 14:55. She knew before she answered it, not because she was given to dark imaginings, but because she was a nurse, and nurses develop a particular relationship with the moments before bad news arrives, a sensitivity to the quality of silence that precedes it. The coordinator from Fairbanks Flight Service was professional and calm. They were treating Davie's aircraft as overdue. A search and rescue operation was already in progress. They had a signal. They were working it. She asked the questions she needed to ask. She got the answers that were available, which were not many. She hung up, stood in her kitchen for a moment, then called her neighbor Carol and asked if Carol could collect the boys from school and keep them for the evening. Carol asked no questions. She had lived in Fairbanks long enough to understand what that particular request meant. Annette drove to the hospital, not because anyone had told her to, because she was a nurse and the hospital was where she knew how to be useful, and being useful was the only way she knew how to manage the next several hours. She checked in for a shift she was not scheduled for. Her supervisor looked at her face and asked no questions. She worked, she focused. She kept her hands busy and her mind on the patients in front of her. And she listened in the part of her that she could not quite quiet for the sound of her phone. On the frozen gravel bar in the Brooks Range, Davie Fulton was fighting a battle that had no dramatic moments, no explosions, no desperate sprints through the snow. Just a man, alone, in the cold, making small decisions, staying present, refusing, hour by hour and sometimes minute by minute, to stop. He understood his situation clearly, and that clarity was important. The pilots who survived forced landings in remote terrain were not always the strongest or the most experienced. They were often simply the ones who assessed their situation honestly and responded to what was actually in front of them. What was in front of Davie was this. He was approximately 40 miles north of Coldfoot, in a ravine that was not on any route anyone would search first. His emergency locator transmitter was active, but he could not verify the signal quality. His radio was dead. His left shoulder was dislocated, which meant his left arm was effectively useless. Two ribs on his right side were either cracked or broken, which made breathing deeply something he had to think about rather than something that happened automatically. The temperature outside was minus 32 Celsius and dropping as the afternoon moved toward evening. Inside the cockpit, with the survival blanket wrapped around him and the small residual warmth of the engine still bleeding through the firewall, it was perhaps minus 15. That gap would close. He had perhaps 4 hours before the cold became incompatible with consciousness. After that, the timeline compressed quickly. He did what he could. He went through the emergency kit with his one functioning hand, a second foil space blanket, which he layered over the first, 2 protein bars, which he ate methodically, not because he was hungry, but because calories were heat and heat was time. A small LED torch, which he propped against the instrument panel. He checked the ELT indicator. The light was blinking at the correct interval. The transmitter was doing its part. Whether the signal was getting through the storm and the terrain to a satellite was a question he could not answer. He wedged himself into the most protected position the cockpit allowed and controlled his breathing, slow and deliberate, shallow enough to manage the ribs. The cold is not what most people imagine. Those who have not experienced genuine extreme cold tend to picture it as an intensification of ordinary winter discomfort. It is not like that. Genuine extreme cold is a presence. It has weight and texture and intention. It gets into the aircraft through the cracked windscreen and the gaps around the door seals and finds the exposed skin first. The face, the hands, the strip of wrist between glove and sleeve. Then it works inward. Davie felt it in his feet within the first hour, a deep aching cold that moved up through his boots and into his calves with a slow grinding persistence that no amount of movement could fully counteract. His hands inside his gloves lost their fine motor function gradually. He tucked them under his arms and preserved what warmth remained. The mind does strange things in extreme cold. As core body temperature drops, the brain begins to ration its resources. Cognitive function slows. Attention narrows. Time becomes unreliable. Davie knew this. He had read enough survival accounts to understand the mechanism. Knowing it did not make it easier to manage, but it made it possible to recognize what was happening, and recognition was the first line of defense. When his thoughts began to drift, he pulled them back deliberately. He thought about the 185, about the first time he had taken George up, and the boy's face when they broke through a low layer of cloud into the blue above it. He thought about Gary, who had his mother's sharpness and his father's stubbornness, and no idea yet what a formidable combination that was going to turn out to be. He thought about Annette, not in a sentimental way, not in a way that felt like goodbye, in the way that a man thinks about the fixed point that everything else in his life is oriented around. The light failed at around 3 in the afternoon. Alaskan winter days are short this far north in November, and the loss of even the gray diffuse light that had been filtering through the cracked windscreen removed something, made the cockpit smaller, made the distance between where he was and anywhere else feel more absolute. The small LED torch propped against the instrument panel threw almost comically little light against the scale of what surrounded it. But it was something. Somewhere around the third hour, he lost consciousness for the first time. Not a dramatic collapse, a slow fading, the thoughts becoming less coherent, the interval between one idea and the next stretching out, and then a gap, a blank space in the record. He came back to himself with no reliable sense of how long he had been out. The torch was still on. The ELT light was still blinking. He was still alive. He took careful inventory, fingers, toes. The shoulder was beyond pain now, which was not reassuring. The ribs caught him hard when he shifted position, which was in a perverse way useful. Pain was information. Pain meant the nervous system was still communicating. He found one of the protein bar wrappers on the seat beside him and folded it very carefully into a small square, just to give his hands something to do, just to confirm that they were still receiving instructions. They were. He settled back, kept breathing. The second time he lost consciousness, he was thinking about the approach into the cabin strip, the slight uphill grade, the way the spruce came right to the edge on the left side, and you had to track just a fraction right of centerline to give yourself the clearance you needed. The particular sound of the tires on frozen gravel. He had been meaning to tell George about that strip. It was a good one to know. The kind of approach that taught you something about reading terrain that you could not get from a textbook. He would tell him when he got home. The thought was still present in some part of him when everything else went quiet. Outside, the storm was beginning, very slightly to ease. The wind dropped half a knot, then another. The satellite passed overhead for the fourth time. And the emergency locator transmitter, damaged and intermittent and doing its absolute best in the wreckage of a small plane on a frozen gravel bar in the Brooks Range, sent up one more pulse into the clearing dark. In the Pave Hawk, Kowalski was on his third grid pass. The drone had been in the air for 40 minutes, working the search box systematically, the thermal feed scrolling across his monitor in the blue and gray palette of cold terrain. He had logged 3 contacts, 2 caribou, and what the resolution suggested was a moose bedded down in a spruce hollow. Nothing that looked like a man, nothing that looked like a plane. He adjusted the search pattern, tightened the grid on the eastern section of the box where the beacon signal had shown its strongest return. It was not much to go on, but it was what they had. Sandra Reeves was on her 4th update call of the operation when the signal came in again. Stronger this time. Cleaner. Not the scattered multipath return that had been confounding the fix for the past 2 hours. Something more direct, more purposeful, as if the transmitter had gathered whatever reserves it had left and pushed them into one final coherent burst. The Cospus SARSAT system grabbed it cleanly, the coordinates locked within 8 seconds. She looked at the fix on her screen and felt the tightening in her chest shift into something different. Not relief, not yet, but the particular focus that comes when a search stops being a probability exercise and becomes a location. She was on the radio to the Pave Hawk before the lock had finished processing. In the aircraft, the navigator had the coordinates overlaid on the terrain map before Sandra finished reading them out. A ravine, east-facing, running roughly north to south between 2 ridgelines approximately 7 miles east of the Koyukuk River. He cross-referenced the topography. The ravine had a flat section at its northern end, a gravel bar, frozen and snow-covered, perhaps 200 meters in length. Exactly the kind of feature a good pilot would have aimed for in a forced landing. He passed the coordinates to the pilot without comment. The Pave Hawk banked hard to the east. Kowalski had the drone repositioned over the target area 4 minutes after the fix came through. He worked it methodically, starting at the southern end of the gravel bar and moving north, the thermal feed cycling through its palette as the sensor swept the snow-covered surface. Blue, gray. The faint orange signature of a rock that had retained some residual heat from a sun that had barely risen that day. Then, at the northern end of the bar, something different, a shape, irregular, partly obscured by drifted snow, but angular in the way that natural objects in a wilderness environment are almost never angular. Straight lines, right angles, the unmistakable geometry of something manufactured, and inside it, very faint, the smeared orange and yellow of a heat signature. Human, almost certainly human, alive, barely, but present. Kowalski did not celebrate. He zoomed the sensor to maximum resolution, confirmed what he was seeing, and spoke 2 words to the flight crew. Got him? The Pave Hawk descended into the ravine. This was not straightforward flying. The walls were close. The wind coming off the northern ridge was unpredictable, generating vortices that the pilot had to anticipate and counter before they had fully developed. The rotor downwash was lifting snow off the gravel bar in sheets, further degrading the already limited visibility. The pilot flew it the way the 210th flew everything, precisely, without drama, making the adjustments that needed to be made at the moment they needed to be made, not a second before or after. He held the aircraft in a stable hover 20 feet above the surface. The door came open. The wind hit the cabin like a wall. Briggs checked his harness one final time, looked down at the crumpled shape of the Cessna below him, noted the position of the wreckage relative to the surrounding spruce, calculated his swing on the hoist. Then he stepped out into the Alaskan night. The hoist lowered him through 30 feet of wind and blowing snow. He landed 2 meters from the cockpit door, unclipped from the hoist hook, moved to the aircraft. The door was jammed, the impact having distorted the frame enough to bind it in the seal. Briggs worked it with both hands, got his weight behind it, and felt it give on the third attempt. The interior of the cockpit was very cold. Davie Fulton was in the right-hand seat, wrapped in 2 survival blankets, his head tilted forward onto his chest. The LED torch was still on, propped against the instrument panel, its small light filling the space with a pale yellow glow. Briggs put 2 fingers to the side of Davie's neck. A pulse, slow, thready, but present. He leaned close to Davie's ear. Mr. Fulton, my name is Aaron. I'm with the Alaska Air National Guard. I'm going to get you out of here. No response. He tried again, louder, cutting through whatever distance the cold had put between Davie and the surface of things. Mr. Fulton, Davie, I need you to hear my voice. A movement, slight, the head lifting a fraction, then very quietly, barely audible above the wind outside. Is that the rotors? Yes, sir, Briggs said. That's the rotors. Getting Davie out of the cockpit was slow work. The dislocated shoulder meant any movement of the left arm had to be managed carefully. The broken ribs meant the transfer from seat to litter required patience and precision that the conditions were not making easy. Briggs worked with the methodical focus of someone who has practiced this specific sequence enough times that the cold and the noise and the urgency do not disrupt it. He had Davie packaged in the hypothermia wrap and secured to the litter in 11 minutes. He reattached the hoist hook, gave the signal. The litter rose into the dark, Briggs riding alongside it, one hand on the frame, his body taking the swing as the wind caught them on the way up. The Pave Hawk crew pulled them in. The door closed. The noise dropped. Warmth, relative and imperfect, but real. Briggs was already working. IV line, core temperature assessment, the quiet, rapid sequence of a pararescueman doing what pararescuemen do when the clock is still running even after the person has been found. Davie's core temperature was 31.2 degrees Celsius, mild to moderate hypothermia. Serious, but survivable. Briggs looked at the number and allowed himself briefly a single exhaled breath. Then he kept working. The Pave Hawk climbed out of the ravine and turned south toward Fairbanks. Below them, the broken Cessna 185 sat on the frozen gravel bar, with its door hanging open and the small LED torch still burning inside the cockpit. The storm was already beginning to drift snow across the fuselage. In a few hours, it would be mostly buried. In a few days, it would be indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain, the tundra reclaiming what had briefly interrupted it. The pilot was not there to see it. 160 miles to the south, Annette Fulton's phone rang in the pocket of her scrubs. She stepped out of the ward into the corridor. She listened. She said thank you. She stood in the corridor for a long moment with her back against the wall, and her eyes closed and her hand pressed flat against her sternum. Then she straightened up, took a breath, walked back into the ward. She had patients to see. Davie was coming home. Fairbanks Memorial Hospital receives its share of hypothermia cases. It is that kind of place, in that kind of climate, serving that kind of community. The emergency department staff know the presentation. They know the protocols. Davie arrived by medevac at 21:14. Core temperature 31.8 degrees on arrival, having climbed slowly during the flight south. Conscious but not fully oriented. The trauma team met him at the door. The rewarming was slow and controlled. A cold heart is an irritable heart, and the instinct to apply heat rapidly has to be overridden by the discipline of doing it properly. Warmed IV fluids, heated blankets, the measured patient application of heat that brought his core temperature up over several hours rather than minutes. The shoulder was reduced under sedation, a clean dislocation, no associated fractures, 6 weeks in a sling, and a longer road back to full strength, but nothing that would not heal. The ribs were 2 fractures on the right side. No pneumothorax, monitored carefully through the first night. The frostbite on his left hand was the injury that concerned the specialist most. The fingers had been cold long enough and deeply enough that the tissue damage was significant. The treatment in the immediate aftermath is controlled rewarming in warm water, which is more painful than it sounds, and then waiting. Waiting to see how much tissue recovers and how much does not. In the first 24 hours, it was not possible to say with certainty whether he would keep all 5 fingers on that hand. Annette was there when he woke up properly, not the partial foggy waking of the first few hours, the genuine return to full consciousness that happened sometime in the middle of the second night. He opened his eyes and she was in the chair beside the bed, still in her scrubs, not having gone home. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. She looked back. "The boys?" he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "With Carol," she said. "They're fine. They don't know the details." He nodded slowly. "The plane's gone," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry," he said. Annette leaned forward and put her hand very carefully over his right hand, the one that was not bandaged, and she held it with a firmness that said everything she did not say out loud. "Don't," she said quietly. He did not. George and Gary came the following afternoon. George walked into the room with the particular careful composure of a boy who has decided he is old enough to handle things. He sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at his father's bandaged hand, and at the sling and at the various attachments that still connected Davie to monitoring equipment. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Curtis messaged. The hunters. He saw it on the news and wanted to know if you were okay." Davie almost smiled. "What did you tell him?" "That you were okay," George said. "Because you are." Gary sat on the edge of the bed, carefully, because Annette had briefed him on the ribs. He did not have his brother's composure, and he was not trying for it. He just sat close and talked about school and about something that had happened with his friend Jamie that was apparently very important and moderately funny. Davie listened to every word. The 11 days in Fairbanks Memorial were not easy. The frostbite treatment was painful in the way that anyone who has experienced the rewarming of seriously cold tissue will tell you it is painful. Not the clean, acute pain of an injury, but something more sustained, more grinding. By the 4th day, the specialist had a clearer picture of the tissue damage. 3 of the 5 fingers on his left hand had responded well to treatment. The ring finger and the little finger were more concerning. There was a period of approximately 48 hours during which the conversations in the room were careful in the way that medical conversations become careful when the news is uncertain. In the end, he kept them both. Reduced sensation, some permanent cold sensitivity, but functional, present, his. He did not say much when the doctors told him. He thanked them and asked what the rehabilitation timeline looked like. That was Davie. The psychological dimension of what had happened took longer to surface than the physical injuries. This is almost always the way. The body has immediate legible needs. The mind processes on its own schedule and does not always give you advance notice of when it is going to present its account. For the first week in hospital, Davie was occupied with recovery. It was after he came home that the nights became difficult. Not every night. not in a way that announced itself as a problem, but the sleep that had always come easily to him became unreliable. He would wake at 2 or 3 in the morning with the specific total alertness of someone whose nervous system had decided that sleep was a risk it was not currently prepared to take. He would lie in the dark and listen to the house, Annette breathing beside him, the creak of the structure settling in the cold, the distant sound of a vehicle on the road outside. Normal sounds, safe sounds. He knew they were safe. That knowledge and the feeling did not always line up. Annette knew better than to push. She was a nurse, and she understood trauma responses in a clinical sense that made her more patient with the one unfolding in her own home than a less informed person might have been. She did not pathologize it. She did not hover. She simply remained present and available and trusted that he would find his way to the conversation when he was ready for it. He found his way to it on a Thursday evening in December, about 3 weeks after he came home. They were sitting at the kitchen table after the boys had gone to bed, the same kitchen table where he had spread his pre-flight paperwork on the morning of the 14th, the same light above the stove. He told her about the second time he had lost consciousness, about the thought that had been in his head when it happened, about telling George about the cabin strip approach. He told her that he had not been ready to go. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he had finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." And somehow that was exactly enough. The question of whether he would fly again was never really in doubt. Not for Davie. Not in the deep part of him, where the actual decisions about his life were made. But it needed to be asked, and he needed to answer it honestly each time. Not with the reflexive certainty of a man who has not actually examined the question, but with the considered answer of someone who has sat with it properly. He sat with it for 7 months. He worked on the shoulder through the winter, physiology sessions twice a week with a woman named Hendricks who was unsentimental about effort and results, which suited him. He regained full range of motion by February, strength by April. The ribs healed on their own timeline. His left hand regained most of its dexterity by March, the two affected fingers slower than the rest but functional. In April, he started going out to the airstrip again, not to fly, just to be there. To sit in the warmth of the hangar with a coffee and watch the aircraft come and go and let the environment be familiar again, rather than loaded. In May, he bought a Piper Super Cub. He spent 6 weeks doing nothing but circuits and local flights, rebuilding the currency and the confidence in equal measure. Not rushing it, not pretending he was further along than he was. The aviation medical examiner cleared him for commercial operations in June. The first commercial flight was on a Tuesday morning in July, a supply run to a fish camp on the Koyukuk River. Routine cargo, 300 pounds of provisions and an outboard motor part that someone had been waiting on for 2 weeks. He did the pre-flight in the early morning quiet, the way he always had. Coffee in the thermos, paperwork on the tailgate of the truck, the sky lightening in the east over the Alaska Range. He checked the weather, clear and calm. High pressure settled over the interior. Visibility unlimited. He climbed in, ran through his checks, taxied to the threshold. He sat there for perhaps 30 seconds longer than he needed to. Not from fear exactly, from something more considered than fear. From the awareness of a man who knows now, in his body and not just in his understanding, what the country below him is capable of. What the sky can become when it decides to. What the margin between a flight that ends normally and one that does not is actually made of. He held that knowledge, did not push it away. Then he pushed the throttle forward. The Super Cub rolled down the strip and lifted into the Alaskan morning. Below him, Fairbanks fell away. The Chena River caught the early light. The road north unspooled toward the horizon. The sky was clear and the air was smooth and the engine note was clean and steady. Alaska does not forgive mistakes. It does not negotiate. It does not offer second chances to every man who tests it. But on a clear July morning, with mouths to feed and a family waiting, and the whole vast country spread out beneath him, Davie Fulton pointed the nose north and he flew. Because some men are built for one thing, and the tundra had come close, but it had not taken it from him. He was still flying. And as long as there was sky above Fairbanks and work to be done, and George and Gary growing up fast in a house on the edge of the last great wilderness, he intended to keep it that way. Before we go, Take a moment to think about the people who made Davie's survival possible. The crews of operations like the 210th Rescue Squadron do not clock in for a normal working day. They train for the worst, deploy into conditions that would ground everyone else, and they go looking for people they have never met in places the rest of us would never go. In Alaska and in mountain ranges and coastlines all over the world, volunteer and funded rescue services exist because communities decided that no one should die alone in the wilderness if there is anything that can be done about it. If you have a mountain rescue team, an air ambulance service, or a search and rescue organization operating near you, please consider supporting them. A donation of any size keeps training funded, equipment maintained, and crews ready. Because the next person on that frozen gravel bar could be anyone. It could be someone you love. And when that call goes out, you want those people to be ready to answer it.